Welcome back to Calvary Life. This is the podcast for Calvary Baptist Church, for the members of Calvary Baptist Church, and anybody else out there that's interested in local church life. I'm Charles.
Hey, I'm Paul. We are sitting here in the top floor of this building, and it's frigid.
It is quite chilly today, and these buildings can get kind of cold, and the heat's going to work fine later, but right now it's kind of chilly. So if you hear us shivering, we'll try to make it through, and just think about being outside where it's really cold. So today, Paul, I thought we would kind of back up and do a history lesson, because I've had some questions that have come to me that, especially during membership class, asking how we as Calvary Baptist Church really began the process of having elders and being elder led. And so I thought we'd just take a few minutes to back up and kind of think through that process. I think it's very interesting, especially as there's not many churches in Dothan, as in Baptist churches, that have elders like we do. So it's a uniqueness to us in that way in Dothan. So just think back to when you came. You came back in spring of 2012. We of course didn't have elders then. We were deacons and committee led and staff led. So what was your initial thought when you came to think? I know from your history that you did have elders. Of course, you're coming now to a church that didn't. What was your thought process in that?
I'll start here. It's kind of ironic that we're talking about this today, because I just got a text this morning from a staff person in another church in another city that wants to meet and talk about implementation of elders in their church. Just came this morning, which is before we even talked about doing this today. To answer that, let me kind of go back a little bit farther in sort of my own trajectory on this. So where I was in South Florida, pastoring at First Baptist Jensen Beach, I'd really become intrigued with the idea of elders, but admittedly, it was probably for the wrong rationale. It was because I was in a church where decision-making was complicated, probably like it had been in Calvary.
Yeah.
When you mention leadership, you're talking about you have staff, hopefully all these areas of leaders, these different categories of leaders are all pulling in the same direction. But what if they're not?
Right.
You got staff, you got deacons, you got committees, and everybody's got some level of decision-making capacity, some level of leadership, and sometimes those things can be in tension sometimes. So anyway, we had similar complicated, leadership structure. Who's making the final decisions? The deacons, is it a personnel committee? Is it a finance committee? Is it the staff? Is everything going to be done congregationally? And as a young pastor, in that frustration, I was looking for how to streamline the process. How can I streamline decision-making process so that we can do things that I feel like we need to do, and we can move quickly and not slowly? So that was actually kind of a bad motivation, and I didn't really think of it that way until I was visiting with an older pastor in our area, and he was pastoring a Baptist church, the only Baptist church that had elders. And so went and consulted with him and talked with him over 2 or 3 occasions. And the gist of the counsel he gave me is this: don't try to make any move on this subject at all until you are convinced biblically that it's the right thing to do. Not because you think it's going to be pragmatic, not because you think it's going to help make decision-making easier for you or consolidate authority or power. Any of those things, those are all poor motivations. Have you searched the scriptures, and do you think this is a biblical model, and why?
Yeah.
And so that led me on a journey away from the pragmatic view to saying, okay, what's the biblical norm? What's the pattern there? And what does that look like in practical terms? How's that going to play out? And so I've given that same kind of counsel to other pastors since then. Don't do this to lubricate the wheels of decision-making or to move things fast or any of the things that I had as previous motivations, because when properly done, sometimes having elders makes things move more slowly. Mm-hmm. And it makes things more difficult sometimes, because now it's not just one person and saying, hey, you support me. Don't question my decisions. Don't touch the Lord's anointed. I've got this vision from God. You follow it. To 4, 5, 6, 7 godly men praying, thinking, considering, using the wisdom that God has given them and the experience and all those things to make decisions. So sometimes it would be much slower, but what I found is it's much safer and much healthier. So anyway, So back to your question for Calvary. So we implemented that at First Baptist Jensen Beach. I can't give you the exact timeline, but probably 5 or 6 years before I finished my ministry there. So we probably had about 5 or 6 year season of elders there. Just seeing the fruit, the benefit, the stability of that. So when I was interviewing with the search committee here, that was one of the things that just came out in discussions. I said, this is just what we do. And here's why I'm convicted that this is the right thing to do. And, of course, one of the early questions was, will that be your intention for us? And I said, ultimately, yes. Doesn't have to happen immediately, but I will be preaching and teaching in that direction because I think it should happen. And I think that's best. So, it wasn't a non-negotiable in coming here. There were no commitments on that score, no promises made. But I did let them know that was my intent because this is what I see as a biblical pattern. I will be teaching this, and I will be encouraging us over time to move that direction. So that's kind of the way it started.
Yeah. So with that, of course, you come into our church. I was here already, so that's why I say our church. It's your church as well now. But so we're here, and we don't. In fact, I can say for me, as even on staff, I did not know anything about the elder-led model. In fact, even you coming, I did not know that Jensen Beach was led that way. That was not even a discussion to us, even as a staff member when you came. And so it was a couple of years into your ministry. Of course, we start doing things in a way that fits your ministry style and fits us better as a church. And through all that, though, I remember hearing things coming from deacons, from deacon meetings about things they were reading that had elder led into it. So talk about how that kind of played out and got to, I guess, why was that the spot to introduce to the deacons elders? What do you?
Probably, and I don't say this in a critical way, Charles. I'm not casting aspersions to other churches who don't do it this way. Everybody has to search the scriptures, do what they think is most biblical. What's the most biblical application of the pattern they see in scripture?
Yeah.
And I know, there are different ways we see that, different ways churches see elders. And sometimes maybe in some places it's semantics, where the staff functions as elders or, whatever it may be. But I think at Calvary, the reason it had to begin with the deacons is because the deacons were functioning in a hybrid pseudo-elder model. They were sometimes deacons serving needs, serving widows, serving practical needs, but they sometimes were elders doing family ministry care, making significant decisions. Obviously when I was, and I don't know what the tenor of the church was, you could speak to this a little bit, where the real authority was centered. But I can still remember, like in that whole interview process towards the end, when I came and visited the church, I can remember it seemed like there were over 60-something deacons I met with in the chapel. Asked me all sorts of questions and everything. And I realized, wow, it really felt like the seat of power was there. Now, obviously, the congregations got to approve, but that's a lot of men. And it just felt like they were operating sort of a hybrid way. Plus, the natural leaders of the church, the people that the church looked to for direction and stability and those things, were in that room. They were in that deacon room. Yeah. And a lot of those men in that room were people who were capable of teaching, who were exercising influence and leadership. You start thinking about in past times of turmoil or difficulty in the church, who was the church already looking to?
Right.
And again, unofficially, because they weren't elders, and they didn't have that position, but they had that influence. Excuse me. So in there, I thought this is where, because most leadership is happening here, the influence of the church is coming from the deacons. The church will follow them. They've got to be convinced. I'm not going to go around them. I need to go with them. I need to lead them along. And if they see this as a necessity, naturally the church will follow.
I guess what I've always assumed with that, of course, I wasn't in all those deacons meetings. The staff didn't attend all the deacons meetings. We would only come if we were asked to at certain times and things, if we had something that was going on. But my assumption to that is that in your training these men and also thinking about how to be a healthy church, this is just one of the big outflows of that training towards them. Because I've been in other deacons meetings since then, and that's a lot of things that we do in those meetings is a read a book together and let you help lead the church, lead the deacons towards training. So I just assumed that that's kind of how it was. This is a healthy book for us to read. This is healthy things for us to think about. And then the deacons kind of did that, and their eyes are open to, well, if we really start thinking about it biblically, what do we do with the concepts of elders in the New Testament?
Yeah, and there wasn't 100% buy-in. I'd like to say there was a great majority, overwhelming majority. We started working through this book, The Church, which was sort of a condensed version of 9 Marks of a Healthy Church, but just a summary book by Mark Dever on again, it's an easy read, starts introducing these subjects, which then let's start looking at these in Scripture, let's start looking at the pattern, let's start talking about them, because I challenge the deacons, is this biblical? Is this biblical? If it is, will we do the right, and again, I don't mean this as a judgmental term for others, will we adjust accordingly to what we think our right response should be? And I will tell you, Charles, and I won't throw anybody under the bus by name, but somebody listening to this may remember, I can remember sitting in one of the most pivotal deacons meetings about this, where we were getting pretty close to at least making some serious moves forward on this, not just talking about it in deacons meetings, and more like, what are we going to do? What action steps are we going to take? And I still remember one of those deacons in there said, I don't care if it's biblical. That's not what Baptists do. And I tell you what, quite unintentionally, that was such a turning point moment. I think for anybody that was on the fence at that moment, that was like a wake-up call. Like, wait, are we going to stick with what we think our patterns are, our traditions are, or are we going to move with what's biblical? Now, we had, minimal, maybe a few families that left the church specifically over this issue. At least that's, what I was told by them, that was their reason. So there were some that opposed it, and it seems a strange thing to me that you would leave over. It's not, it's not a teaching issue. It is a practical application issue, but nonetheless, most were in agreement.
Yeah.
So once you could get a sense. Again, multiple meetings. I can't tell you exactly the timeline, Charles, but it was many. We were slow walking this from the beginning.
Right.
But once you could see there was a consensus in the deacons, I was starting to get the response of, okay, so what are we going to do? What's our next step then?
Yeah, and with that, of course, I always laugh at the name that came out of it, because it's just, I don't know what you would call these guys, but it just was always funny to me that they became the Elder Task Force. It was a task force.
That's what we do. We do task force, special committees. I don't know.
And so, this group and really what it was in what I remember is it was the past chairmans for a few years before then became this group of deacons that the deacons task with the idea of, okay, how do we move the church in this direction?
Well, it seemed like a natural group because that was the group of leaders among leaders. So the deacons select their own chairman. Pastor wasn't doing that. They were selecting their own chairman among themselves and approving it. And so here are the past 5. So this represents, at least 5 years of leadership and sometimes more, because some of those guys had served multiple terms or had come back around again. So it was a consensus leadership group that no one would argue against. And that's really where the rubber started to meet the road, because we started to meet, I think it was on Monday nights. And I can remember we were meeting in Sam Robinson's conference room at his office, and we were just hashing it out. 2 or 3 hours, sometimes a night, just working through things, working through books that we were reading together, things I was recommending to them, working through documents from other churches and bylaws and what they did with elders, and some of those guys were doing some of their own research and talking to other pastors and getting counsel about things, and so we were just good, healthy conversation with a lot of notes being taken around that table till we got to the point where we felt like, all right, we have a plan. We have a plan. And then the discussion moved from what's on this paper to how do we start introducing this to the church.
Right. And even that, like you said, with the deacons having kind of that, how I saw it at the time, you asked me what I saw was in the leadership structure. The church was congregationally governed. And every decision did come to the church. Like I can remember decisions in the past before you came that the staff would bring a recommendation and the church would say no. And so there was a congregationally governed church in that. And so from what I saw, the deacons could also bring a recommendation, and their recommendation carried weight because, like you said, it was 60 men or whatever, and so it carried weight to the congregation to then do that. So in some ways, they were acting like the pseudo elders, which is what we kind of do today. You know, the elders will make a recommendation to the church, and the church still makes that decision. So I think you're right in that the deacons was the biggest group of church members who had the power to lead the church in a way, but it was still, and still is today, ultimately defined by governing by the congregation itself.
Yeah, and that was all part of the learning curve, of course, for people, is explaining to them what elders means and what it doesn't mean. You know, and I'm no expert in Presbyterian church ecclesiology, church life, but, you know, I know there are teaching elders and ruling elders, and ultimately you would say those ruling elders in a setting like that, in a sort of a Presbyterian model, would be the authority in the church. And we maintain and believe it's the biblical pattern that a church is congregationally governed ultimately. And so explaining to people, this is not all the decision making. This is the spiritual leadership of the church. So sometimes it's going to be on practical matters. Elders are going to consider things that are vital to the health and life of the church. But, you know, I can remember some of those Q&A sessions, well, the big Q&A we had, answering questions like this. We're not establishing an Uber committee. You know, the work of elders isn't primarily to decide what color the carpet's going to be. But a recommendation of the elders might be when it's time to expand a building or to plant a church, or, you know, those things are about church health. But primarily it's going to be about spiritual life and spiritual leadership. That's the primary role, to take care of the people, to take care of the needs of the church spiritually so the church can be healthy and stable. Yeah. And, you know, we didn't just do this as a reaction, but, you know, because the church had gone through some turmoil, it did seem to be a necessary healing step too,
right?
For the sake of the church. Again, that's not a rationale to do it. If your church is going through a rough time, or, you know, if you had some difficult leadership transitions, move to elders. No, but it did seem to be like a healing balm, I think, ultimately, and it just created a sense of stability.
Yeah, and I've said this before. You know, I've of course grew up here. And had some other turmoil that happened even before, you know, throughout the history of Calvary has had some issues with leadership and leadership failure. And because of that, I really felt like all those years there was a mistrust of the congregation towards the leadership, especially towards the staff. And I really think because the members of Calvary chose these leaders as elders, it was the first time that I've ever seen in my lifetime where the church actually trusts the leadership that's there. And I just think, you know, you coming in, you're trustworthy. You know, other pastors may have been trustworthy, but the church just never really gave their trust to the staff because of the hurt that had happened in the past. And I really think because now they have men who have been here all their life and are now elders and are able to lead, and they've seen them live out their faith in front of them, that there's really, I think, more trust in our congregation towards the leadership and the elders leading than there ever has been before.
Yeah, I think so. I think you're exactly right. You know, the trust I have coming in as a new guy, it's a conditional trust. I mean, we don't really know you,
right?
And we're going to give you a shot here, but you're held a little bit at arm's length. Let's see how this plays out. And then, you know, if I make some difficult decisions early on, and maybe some things I would rethink in hindsight, how I went about some of those things, and the pace of them, the quickness of making some of those decisions, may have saved us some difficulty. So, you know, you can quickly erode trust. And then, you know, there's just so many factors here. You know, our church we're like 73 years old now.
Right.
There've been a lot of pastors here, a lot of staff here. Now, in general, we've had long tenures. So, you know, I'm coming up on 14 next month, and, you know, my predecessor 25, and, you know, I don't know the history really all before that. Obviously, they were somewhat shorter before that, but stability. But you're right on that. So when we introduce elders, it wasn't me saying, these are my guys.
Right.
These are the guys I'm picking to be my elders, to lead us. And so I'm imposing leadership on you. Who do you see among you that fits these biblical criteria? Who, in fact, you know, this was our first criteria with that first group of elders. We asked this question in the congregation: who is already eldering you?
Mhm.
Who's already shepherding you, leading you? And a few people just began to emerge, kind of maybe for different reasons. They're very different personality types,
Right.
but they were go-to people for what should we do and how do we handle this? And there were also people that had the personal investment in the church long enough that they were trusted.
Right.
And that's why if there are other pastors listening to this who are ever considering this, in a very real way, the lay elders are more important to the process than the staff elders are. Than even maybe I'm first among many, or first among elders in the process where they'll look to me for leadership, but we're equal in those decision-making things. But the real stability comes from those people that have, again, I'm coming up on 14 years. Well, one of our elders was baptized as a child here.
Right.
Others have been here for 2 decades, 3 decades. That's where real credibility is. And those are people who've weathered difficult times and things. And so that's where that real healthy stability comes from. And so I do think, and I feel like the church does, I feel like the church trusts those people and they trust that system.
Yeah. I think it's been a great, I think we've seen how biblical leadership works, as in this is God's plan, and it really has been a helpful benefit that I didn't know we needed either at the beginning. So back to the history. So of course we get to so the deacons make recommendations to the church and start doing some training or some teaching. I'd say group teaching. You mentioned the Q&A, those kind of things, and then
we taught it all through our small groups.
Yeah, and then even together, and so we had Q&A all the church all together, and through that also in the same time you through that task force decided that we needed to train men to be these deacons or be these elders, which some of them were deacons. But so with that, I remember I was a part of that training. That was back in November of 2017. And so you really put together, I think it was about 9 weeks worth of material for us to read on our own and then also be trained. And what was your mindset to what do I need to make sure these guys understand in that? Do you remember?
It was a bit scattershot. Then I kind of just unloaded the dump truck on everybody then, because some of it was just foundational. One, I wanted them to know biblically what elders are. That our primary responsibilities were to feed the flock, guard the flock, lead the flock, versus secular models of leadership. This is not. Even the terminology that we use, it sounds like semantics sometimes, but I really try to make sure we're always using words like the elder council, because we serve together as a council of leaders. And the Bible says in the multitude of counselors there's safety, not elder board. I don't want to be perceived as that. We're not the admin team. We're not the executive committee. That sort of thing. We serve. And the other, and again, the definitions. This was probably the biggest leap. And it's still in process always with new people coming into the church, even with people who've been here for a while, is that biblically we're not making a distinction between the word elder and pastor. Mm-hmm. Now there is a different occupation. There are different assignments, responsibility. Obviously, I have the assigned task of being the senior pastor who's primarily responsible for teaching. But as far as the biblical criteria and the character traits, all those things, it's a synonymous term. And so teaching that is probably the biggest overriding principle. Guys, if you become an elder, it's not just so you can help make decisions. It's so you can teach and lead and shepherd these people. Yeah. Because I think that's what's emerged ultimately over time. The biggest picture is we need more people to care for the people that we have. Originally, people had ideas, and they're not wrong. They're just a facet of it, like accountability. Accountability is a facet of it because, I share with the church even back then, look, in reality, what's going to happen in this church? Let's say give me 4 or 5 years where I got some roots down, right? So I've been here a little while, started putting my stamp on things, so to speak. You fundamentally disagree with something I'm doing or teaching. What are you going to do? Well, here's what typically happens in a church. You may come and see me. You may come and talk to me about it, voice your frustrations, your complaints. What if I don't receive it well? What if I don't agree with you? What if I do nothing with your complaints? Well, a lot of people are going to do this. You can start complaining to other people. You're going to see if you can build a little coalition. Are there other people that see it your way? Yeah. Do they want the same thing that you want? Do they disagree? And you might push for change that way. But again, if I'm ensconced enough into the church and immovable, then you're either going to just get frustrated and leave, or at best, you're going to take some other people with you, and you're just going to go. Well, what happens in an elder-led church if there's poor teaching or poor leadership? Well, the accountability is clear. So it's not the same as a personnel committee who, we shifted that responsibility primarily to like the HR,
Right.
to salary and benefits and job descriptions and those kind of things, because biblically we thought that accountability and structure needs to come from elders. So there's accountability built in. That's just one facet of it. Then there's decision making. What's a wise course of action for the sake of the church? And when you bring in lay elders who've been there for a while, they're not short-sighted.
Right.
They know history, they know people, they know the culture, and they're looking long view. So I'm coming in new. I'm looking like, I want this now. I want to change this, and this. Those elders are able to say, look, these are our people. These are our needs. This is why they're going to resist that, because this has happened. These are the things that we're going to have to teach to get there. It's just a better model for the church overall. So anyway, back to that teaching time. I wanted them to know biblical definitions, roles and responsibilities, and then kind of eliminate some of the myths in the whole thing. And constantly pointing them back to the role of elders in relationship to the church. We have an authority that's based on teaching, not based on office.
Yeah.
Church still has to make the decision. So we look to model of Paul dealing with the Corinthians and bringing sin to bear. You must do this. You should put this brother out. You should take action here. The church had to do that. So starting to teach those things. Here's how we lead. We lead through the authority of Scripture. Is this right? Is this biblical? Is this good? And in the church, we ask the church to affirm or endorse that.
Yeah. And I remember there was about, like I said, 25, 30 men in that room. And as just those guys that, either aspire to it, or some were just interested in more teaching as well. And of course, we've seen we've seen some of those guys actually then become the elders of the one or two groups of elders that we've had.
And those that didn't were advocates for.
Oh, yeah.
As deacons and things, they came to the conclusion, that's probably not me. That's not where I see God using me. But it changed the way they served as deacons or as small group leaders.
Yeah.
So it was all for the good.
Yeah, and so that was in 2017, 2018, and then middle of that year, the church actually changed the bylaws. At the same time, we were working on bylaws, which the task force was really involved in, of getting that wording right of how the elders became part of the officers of the church, so to speak, and had that leadership role. And then, of course, the church, in a vote, voted to add this to our bylaws and become an elder-led, congregationally ruled church. And so that happened in the spring, and then July of that year, we actually voted to install our first 3 lay elders, the first class of elders. And that was just to me, looking back on that, seeing the guys that were picked, like you said, I think they were home runs.
Yeah,
Everyone
just slam
was just
dunks.
so easy, the guys that were picked there.
Yeah, I don't remember exactly, but probably all 3 of those were unanimous, I would guess.
Yeah, I don't remember exactly.
If it wasn't, it would be a 1 or 2,
Right.
1 or 2 votes against or something, just, for whatever reasons we didn't know that weren't shared with us.
Yeah.
But just easily recognizable people as leaders. I'd like to think, looking at the big span of history of the church, that the church could sort of rest easy then. Because there's another aspect to this too we didn't even really talk about. Talking about, in most churches, pastoral transitions bring massive change.
Right.
And it's not that I'm trying to preserve my way of doing things or my personal style or that sort of thing, but I do think there is a more biblical way of doing church, so I would like to see that sustained. But you think about the huge pendulum swing, because you worked under both pastors in the same position as executive pastor. Philosophically, even theologically, big swing.
Right.
In how we do things, what we're doing, that sort of thing. So what happens when my tenure is over? Again, I'm not saying that the church will elect someone like me to the position, but there'll be fundamental things I believe that will stick now.
Right.
That's one of the reasons why it's so important that we went through this thing slowly, because one of the counsels I got way back when in my previous church in South Florida was, if you don't move slowly through this, by your position, and this is what I would say to any pastors that are listening, maybe some of the younger guys in particular, you can push through a lot of things just by virtue of the position that you're in. And you won't maybe intentionally do this. You're not intentionally trying to manipulate, I would hope. But if the church loves you and you're teaching and they want you there, they'll do things you want to do, even if they don't really agree with it.
Yeah.
That's just really true.
Right.
I don't want him to get upset and leave. I mean, let's just follow. Or some people will do it just because they feel like they really should just follow whatever the pastor says.
Right.
You can push things through. But what happens when you're not the guy anymore? You know, what happens in 2 or 3 years when all of a sudden, well, I feel God calling me someplace else? Well, here's what's going to happen to those major changes that there was never really buy-in. It's going to snap back like a rubber band.
Mm-hmm.
And so I would like to think for us, like you're going through some of the timeline. So the date was 2017 we first elected?
2018.
2018. Okay. So, all right. So this year, when we get to this summer, we'll be 8 years in.
Yeah.
So we've been through a few cycles of new elders coming on and that sort of thing. I mean, I'd like to think by now it's pretty ingrained.
Yeah.
So, maybe another year or two, we're a decade into this. It's, the longer we do that, the more it's just part of our church culture. I would even say at this point, I wouldn't see it shifting.
Yeah.
I wouldn't see it shifting under new leadership. One way or another, this model of church leadership is going to endure, I think.
Yeah. I think really it would, whoever that next candidate may be, when you get 85 and you finally decide to quit being pastor. So when that happens, I think that'll be one thing that they're looking for in the next pastor is it won't be a discussion of, well, you might, you don't have this, you don't have to necessarily have this. I think this is who we are, and we'll be looking for somebody that also agrees that the biblical way to do this is a plurality of elders.
Yeah, and would embrace it. Wouldn't see it as an obstacle, but would see it as a gift.
Yeah,
to them.
Exactly. One more question before we stop. I just thought of this, and this sometimes comes up. How many elders do you think? Now, of course, not an exact number, but generally, how many elders do you think this flock needs?
This is going to be kind of an abstract answer. I think ideally, we need as many elders as it takes for every elder to have at least a care of a segment of the congregation that they know personally. So whatever that number is, it's, I try hard. This is not a cop out. I really do struggle with names sometimes, and I'll just sitting there. I'll see somebody, I can't think of the name, and
right.
Particularly people that I've not been in a small group with, or they've not been in an open class with me. They're members, or if I didn't do their membership interview or anything. Sometimes plus, in a given month, we might have 800 people pass through here.
Yeah.
Different people, including kids and things. I can't know everybody. Well, but even if I had a great capacity for all the names, I can't be personally involved as much as I would like to be until there are crises that demand it.
Right.
It would be great if everybody had pastoral care as needed. Obviously, I'm available whenever demand arises, but that's what we're aiming for. So, we have these elder assignments over life groups, which means the people within those life groups. And I think ideally, we need as many elders as it takes to give sufficient pastoral care to everybody, the whole congregation.
But yeah, but you would say also in that would you say that there's a max that really becomes cumbersome, maybe? Or
yeah. Well, we need to make sure, and again, anybody listening and think about elders, this is something we had to talk about too in those early stages. We have to guard against all the time. We never want to communicate this idea that an elder position is like an honor that you get to graduate to. Like, I don't know a good way to describe this. I can remember, best way I can imagine it in my own head is I can remember years ago when I was on a mission trip in Haiti, and I preached at a big church on a Sunday morning, and their ushers and deacons literally had uniforms on, and almost like military, they had stripes, and there were ranks among these guys. Well, of course, if there are ranks and you're a man, you want to aspire to a higher rank, right? If you're a Boy Scout, you want more merit badges. You want to make your way up to Eagle Scout. We got to make sure in church life we're not saying elders are the Eagle Scouts.
Yeah.
If you're a deacon, you work way up. You can get to a Life Scout, but if you want to go become an Eagle, you got to become an elder. We don't want this just as a promotion. A merit badge given for long service or good service, that sort of thing. We really want to focus in on a real sense of calling to this because, you and I are both paid, right? So that doesn't mean we don't sacrifice. It doesn't mean we don't give time above and beyond. But to serve as an elder, there's no compensation for that.
Right.
And it can be pretty demanding. Those guys would tell you. Sometimes really, maybe I should tell them more that I appreciate them. I'm really surprised at what some of our guys do sometimes on their own.
Yeah.
Just taking things on and taking people on and taking people to lunch and meeting with people and calling people and just they're doing it. They're in there with them. My point is this: people have to be really called to this, to the ministry side of this, to the teaching side of this, and as we develop more people, I think there's two streams of. This is maybe a separate subject a little bit, but two streams of elder development for us. We need elders who are going to serve this church well and long. Mm-hmm. But others who are aspiring to be elders because they want to teach and lead, I want us to develop elders that we're going to send out of here.
Yeah.
Because we don't just need to compile. Like you said, it does become a cumbersome thing where it becomes less effective, less efficient. And I don't want to minimize the role of deacons because there's so many functions, so many ministries that require good, solid, wise, godly leadership to make those ministries go, to serve those ministries. That we need deacons, and the Bible doesn't say, there's nothing in Scripture that ranks elders and deacons. It gives two offices. These are two offices, and they're both vital. They have the same qualifications. The difference between the two primarily is that teaching leadership role by teaching, preaching and teaching, but they're equally vital, equally important. So, what no church should do is gut their deacons to bloat the elders. Mm-hmm. That handful of committed people who will really do this, not just hold the position, not just hold the title, but really would do the work in it, and also encouraging people to serve as deacons.
Yeah.
But to the degree that we developed, more than we needed, then the only rationale for that would be because we're developing them and send them out.
Yeah, yeah, and we're seeing that right now. We're in the process right now of having an elder be voted in by the church to go be sent out. We've had one already in Zach, and getting really close for them to start their church, East Avenue. And then, of course, in the process right now, the church is praying about Stephen Whitfield and voting him to be the second elder that we send out. So we're in the process of that.
And Lord willing, we'll look back years from now, I hope, and say, remember when we did that at Ozark, and then the next one, and then the next one, and we could follow that pattern and see it happen again.
And so there's a pull on both ends. And one thing we like to see that happening, but then again, it makes us thinner. And like we've talked about in other ways, we've got to train up, build up new men to take those roles and refill ourselves so that we can stay healthy too. So it
forces the issue. I don't know who used the phrase first, but we have to churn up the roster. We got to get the next man up, and we're seeing that already. We're seeing some good people step up already.
Yeah.
And that just needs to be the pattern. That's another thing too, which again, we could branch off on so many implications of this, is we're not trying to keep one older group of men. When we say elder, typically are older because they're wise and experienced, but the point of this is not just keep power consolidated in one small group. No, we're trying to develop people. But again, we don't want to just accumulate. We want to disseminate that leadership. And so, churn up that next group to be pastors, leaders, and go do it somewhere.
Yeah. So, I'm very thankful that God has put on your heart before you even got here, and then put on the heart of the church and the deacon leadership to get us to a place where we do have a functioning elder council that really does care for the people. And I think leads well, and then of course the congregation is trusted and bought into, and I think it's a great way to see church life happen.
I would say, just real quick in closing, if anybody's considering this, it starts with personal conviction on the subject, that of the person, of the leader, the pastor that wants to see the church. You got to be convinced of Scripture, not pragmatism. And second, I would say you got to start building some consensus with people, and take your time, take longer than you think it's going to take. Move slowly on it. And the last I would say is, don't expect perfection on this. Your system of elders is only going to be as good or as healthy as the men who are elders. That's kind of goes without saying. But churches don't run on healthy systems. They run with healthy people, healthy leaders. Healthy systems support that, shouldn't be opposed to that. But creating the right system is not going to guarantee health. It's going to be the people that you train slowly, the people that emerge, the people that the church clearly sees, slowly over time, walk it slow, and I think things will, in God's timing, fall into place.
Yep. All right. Well, that's it for us. We are for God, for Dothan, and for the world.